Good evening. If you lived in Massachusetts in the 1980s, you will surely remember the landmark court case about toxic waste in Woburn and a spate of cancer in young children. The movie, a civil action starring John Travolta, recounted the story of 8 Woburn families who suspected a link between their incidences of cancer and a contaminated water supply, where companies, including W.R. Grace, had dumped toxic chemicals for many years. The families won an $8 million settlement, and the Environmental Protection Agency began the expansive process of trying to clean that and dozens of other polluted sites and rivers. Tonight, WGBH and the New England Center for Investigative Reporting reveal that 30 years later, many Massachusetts sites, including Woburn, still live with a toxic legacy. One of those towns is Ashland, home to a plant whose waste practices ultimately turned deadly. Jared Bowen reports.
For 60 years, starting in 1917, the town of Ashland was poisoned. Nyanza, a company that manufactured dyes and pigments on a 35-acre site here, simply dumped its chemical waste into the ground. It was a time long before environmental regulations, although residents like Bernie and Marie Kane certainly knew something wasn't right.
Because there was talk of the water turning blue and yellow and people hanging clothes out and they were turning colors, and there was something that was all right around the Nyanza site.
And animals. They would find deceased animals.
Yeah.
Nyanza operated until 1978, and the poisoned land remained untouched for another 7 years, until the EPA gave it Superfund status and named it one of the 10 most toxic sites in the country. The soil and water in and around the Nyanza site was a horrid concoction of hazardous waste. Cleanup commenced, but by then the poison had taken hold. A cancer cluster emerged, one later linked by the Department of Public Health directly to Nyanza.
We started to pinpoint it on a map, and it was amazing. We had actually tipped red heads on the pins, and you'd see a whole bunch here and a whole bunch there. It was amazing. Then all of a sudden, all downtown, it was all right around Nyanza.
And ultimately devastating. At just 25, the Kane's son Kevin was diagnosed with lung cancer, one of 4 kids in his small high school class to develop highly unusual forms of the disease. He spoke with Greater Boston in 1998 on his old baseball field near Nyanza. At the time, he was waging what would be a successful campaign to link the site to the town's cancer cluster.
I think it was 2 summers I played here. You're like, that was great. And then you think, wow, could something have ever happened then? Or was it later? Or was it before? Or was it then?
11 months after his diagnosis, Kevin Kane died.
He wanted it cleaned up. He didn't want it to happen to anybody else.
13 years later, much, but not all, of the Nyanza legacy is cleaned up. It's buried beneath a serene field behind what was the Nyanza plant, says the EPA's Robert Chancharulo.
And what you're seeing here is basically a containment area landfill that we constructed, completed in 1992, which much of the contaminated soils and sludges and other waste were consolidated and then capped here. Basically the cap here is about 4 feet thick, a couple feet of clay, a plastic liner, and topsoil.
Nearby homes have been fitted with toxic vapor shields, and behind the field, the EPA carved out a giant trench to divert rain and groundwater.
So if this wasn't here, that water would sort of continue to flow and could pick up contamination going, as it went through towards the river.
The Sudbury River, which is still contaminated. Despite 26 years of cleanup efforts costing over $50 million, Nyanza still poses imminent health risks, according to the EPA.
What is the contamination here specifically?
Yeah, so it is basically the big driver of the risk here is mercury in fish tissue. So our remedy, basically the cleanup plan that we've set out, is what we call thin layer capping, which is essentially adding an additional layer of clean sand or sediment on the bottom of the reservoir.
For now, though, it remains a hazard. This Framingham Reservoir, a repository of the Sudbury, is restricted land surrounded by a fence. But when we arrived here, we found a man fishing, whom EPA officials immediately lectured.
But how can you really fully protect people against these contaminants?
Right. Well, it's certainly a challenge where there are popular publicly accessible fishing spots. We do have warning signs posted throughout the river. This wasn't one of those spots just because of its location, but we might reconsider that after today.
But money is the chief reason the Sudbury is still contaminated. Unlike other Superfund sites, no one responsible for the Nyanza dumping is around to pay for the cleanup. So the federal government must foot the bill, and with 1,700 Superfund sites nationwide, there's a line.
How do you answer somebody who says, it doesn't make any sense to me that we're in a queue here for a cleanup process when you have fish that's contaminated?
Right. Well, all we can, our role really in the regional office overseeing these sites is to do the investigation and recommend what we think is the best cleanup plan. To the extent that resources are limited, hard decisions have to be made. But I think the important point is, everything will get funded.
It's a tough thing to ask, though, isn't it? To ask for patience for contamination.
Yeah, right. And again, that's when people sort of, and again, I know there's frustration out there sometimes in the pace of the cleanup, but then it's, if we're weighing never versus, maybe a decade or more in some cases, again, we're on the job.
Which for the Canes is enough. The worst, they say, is over.
They're monitoring it very carefully, but whether or not it'll ever be free of contaminants, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
Right now,
about
it's safe, but the cap that they put on there is very safe. So, and they were very cooperative. They were good, indeed.
And Jared Bowen is here along with attorney Jan Schlichtman, who won the Woburn case, and Paul Locke from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Welcome to all of you. Jared, first of all, I cannot believe you found somebody fishing out there. Just, they must know, they probably don't care, but what is the status of it now? I mean, what about the land that the Nyanza plant was on? Is it for sale? Would anybody buy it? What?
Well, so there are still factory buildings on the actual Nyanza property, which are now inhabited by another company. A lot of the buildings have been taken down. The land is still owned by that company, from what I understand, and there's nothing they can do. For a while, Ashland was looking to expand its downtown development, and they were considering using that land, but there's really nothing they can do with it. First, for liability issues. I mean, the soil is still very contaminated there. It's not a problem when you're walking around on it like we were walking around on it, because it's capped, as he was saying, beneath 4 feet. Of protection and soil, but it still poses health risks if it were to surface. I mean, this is material that does not break down. They were telling me one thing that companies often do with these sites is they're now across the country putting solar panels on it, because that's one of the few uses they can actually find for it.
Wow.
And I should just mention that man who was fishing, he was a neighbor. He was aware of the threat there,
sure.
and he said he was just doing catch and release, but it speaks to a larger point. It's a beautiful spot. Yeah. Anybody can go there, and a lot of people want to go there because it's a really peaceful place.
So, Jan, it's hard to believe, 30 years since Woburn. I mean, W.R. Grace is not only tied to the site that you were so successful in your lawsuit, but 7 other super sites that are still active. What is the status, I should ask first, of the Woburn site?
Well, in Woburn, it was a $70 million 50-year cleanup, and we're still in the decades of that cleanup. Fortunately, the sites that were the sources of the contamination have been removed as sources. That's really important. But the damage that was done to the environment is still going to take decades to repair before nature can actually heal itself. That's just a lesson of how destructive these things are to the environment, how hard it is, how easy it is to destroy the environment, how hard it is to fix it.
One of the interesting things about the Nyanza case, there was a direct correlation made between incidents of cancer. That's very unusual. It never really happened in your case.
Well, no, actually, no. Nyanza and Woburn are the two times where the Department of Health, doing landmark cutting-edge science, was able to show a connection between environmental contamination and a blight of cancer in the community. And those studies are really historic, and they provide hope that other communities will be able to determine whether, in fact, sites are a source of contamination. They showed that the science can do that. So they do stand for that. They also stand for how profound these sites can affect public health, which is another reason why we need to be very mindful and devote the resources to cleaning up these sites rather than just investigating and talking about them.
Paul, I was shocked to learn that there's 3,000 to 5,000 sites just in Massachusetts alone. It isn't just these super sites that we I mean, they're all over the place. They're all little neighborhoods and everything. And I should quickly add that there's no bad guys in this. It's not the EPA or the Department of Environmental Protection, which you work, but it's the time and in some respects the hopelessness of really getting to ever being able to clear it out.
Well, they do range from the very, very complicated sites that we've seen, like Nyanza, like Woburn, but the 3,000 to 5,000 that you mentioned that are open, active sites being assessed and cleaned up right now, they range from those sites to the simple neighborhood gas station, the tanker truck that overturns.
The lead paint.
And they're not lead paint.
Oh, no,
that's not under our statute, unfortunately. But there's also about 30,000 sites that have been cleaned up in Massachusetts. Lesser sites than the Superfund sites, but local sites that have local effects. And a lot of those are being redeveloped once they're clean, or actually the cleanup goes along with the redevelopment.
I mean, one of the problems is that you can't get blood from a stone. So you got these companies that have all gone out of business, and many of them, the federal government did go after them, making them pay for 70% of the original cleanup, and then there was a tax beyond that. Then the tax went away because for a lot of other reasons. So there isn't as much money. There's still $1 billion a year, but that's a spit in the bucket, huh?
We stand in line looking for our turn for New Bedford Harbor, for Nyanza. We have a lot of sites where a lot of actions have been taken to deal with the exposures that are happening. Nobody is drinking contaminated water in Woburn. So the EPA acts very quickly to take action to stop the exposures and to prevent risk. But that's different from saying cleaning up the site for all uses into the future, and that takes money. And right now I think EPA, much like DEP, given the limited resources, the things we have to focus on is preventing the exposure as quickly as we can to make sure people aren't being harmed. But that is a lot different from cleaning up the site.
We can't keep cutting the budgets, and we can't. We have to ask the industry to pay their fair share. If we don't do those things, we're just not going to have the people, the resources to be able to deal with these problems.
And there's such an incredible layer of bureaucracy, I have to say, in observing this too, because the money was there for a while, which was fantastic. And then when you have a case like Nyanza, where the company folded, and then 7 years later is when they finally started to evaluate this and realize they had a cleanup plan. They had nobody to go after, so they're entirely taking money from the government here. And there's a huge process about first you have to do the surveying, and then you have to come up with a strategy, a plan, like they have done with the Sudbury River, where they're going to lay all the soil down to try to suppress these mercury contaminants, and then they have to go back and get the money to actually do that. Meanwhile, you've got 26 miles of river running through all of these communities. That's incredibly contaminated in the sense that if you eat multiple fish, which hopefully people aren't doing, but if you do, that's your damage.
You know, Jen, there was such a wanton recklessness, and I can remember even back in the 80s when that story first broke, everybody was shocked. I mean, it seemed an obvious, cause and effect from dumping this kind of stuff. At the time, I can remember thinking, gee, $8 million, that's great, but it's nothing now. I mean, that's all you got for those families who lost all their little children and everything. Anyway, you can go back at that?
Well, I mean, I think that the importance of Woburn was that it showed people that contaminated sites can profoundly affect public health, and that's why we have to care about these things. So I think that lesson has now been shared really with everyone else, so that every community can take hope that they must be vigilant, they have to be aware of what's happening in their community, and they have to provide the public support so that agencies get the funds and the resources necessary to deal with this problem, or there will be other Woburns if we don't learn the lessons of Woburn.
Paul, on the issue of specific places like Nyanza that has had this correlation made, do they set priorities that? I mean, and look at the family of Kevin Kane, who's been so patient all these years, and Kevin himself, who we interviewed over 10 years ago, knew in his heart that there was a connection there. I mean, do they look at that site and say, no, this has got to be a priority?
They do. EPA and DEP tries to prioritize sites by looking at the exposures. Are people drinking contaminated water? Are people breathing contaminated air? Those are direct known exposures that if you have indoor air that's contaminated, you can't tell people to stop breathing the air. You have to take action. So, for instance, in Nyanza, there's a neighborhood that has these vapor intrusion systems to take the potentially contaminated air away from the houses through the basement so that we're sure that the air that they're breathing is clean. That's how it gets prioritized, to make sure that those exposures aren't happening anymore. But you can look at that as kind of stopgap measures. You deal with the symptom, but you're not dealing with the entire site.
Jared, this is part of a bigger investigation that you and the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, I mean, it's expansive. It's not just this one site, so it's the whole state. It's actually the whole country.
Right. Well, this looked at the fact that there are about, as you mentioned, there are thousands of toxic sites in Massachusetts, and as we were mentioning, it could be anything from a minor oil spill to these 35 Superfund sites, 4 of which have been totally cleaned up, but there are still 34 that people aren't aware of, and that's part of the problem too, is that you have changing populations. I mean, we were just out in Ashland not too long ago for our Where We Live series, talking about the rising and the rising Indian population there, who've just
nobody rang that bell.
No, exactly. But they've only come in the last 10 years or so because they're drawn to the technology corridor and whatnot, and they don't necessarily know the history. So it's sort of having to re-educate. The Canes have actually moved to neighboring Hopkinton. I mean, and they are familiar with what's been a legacy in Ashland. Their kids were sneaking out and swimming in these purple and blue pools because they were so intrigued by this water. That's not there anymore, but the legacy isn't necessarily there for new residents.
We're not talking about this 30 years from now. Jared Bowen, Jan Schlickman, Paul Luck, thanks so much. All right, for more information on this investigative report or to watch more on the Nyanza cleanup efforts, you can visit our website at wgbh.org. Meanwhile, the New England Center for Investigative Reporting contributed to this report and is a nonprofit investigative reporting newsroom based at Boston University. BU journalism student Jenna Ebersole contributed to this report.